But Ludivine, we're now going to pass across to your wonderful self to give us a little bit of insight as to what do we actually mean by the G, or the governance within ESG. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much to Sarah and to Rose for organizing this meeting. And frankly, thanks to Susan for pretty much setting up my entire talk. I think for those of you who know me, I'm firmly of the view that governance is in fact one of the fundamental tools for the integration of stakeholder interests and sustainability concerns more widely. And I mean, I'm just really happy to hear that there is so much forward-looking work that's going into the shaping of the S parameters, because I think governance primarily serves to allow those, as well as the environmental factors, to really become part of a holistic view of an exploration and mining company's performance. So let me start by a little bit of policy talk, because you know I like that, and then we'll get a little bit of a reality check and see how that actually works in real life. Very clearly, the integration of stakeholder interest and sustainability concerns has been happening at many levels. And I think in terms of policy, at least, we are moving, or perhaps have already moved past the false cost to value dilemma. And I think we're seeing that across legal frameworks applicable to exploration and mining in the countries where they take place, in industry standards, many of them have already been mentioned by previous speakers, in the regional, national, and market standards that apply to downstream buyers and users of the product, and also in corporate governance and investor stewardship codes. And I just want to raise a little bit of a flag around corporate governance codes themselves. The most recognized corporate governance frameworks have defined a link between governance, and in particular directors' duties, and sustainability and stakeholders for a long time. I mean, we can cite the UK Companies Act, which dates to 2006, for example. But there's now a lot of calls for a shift from an obligation for directors to consider sustainability and stakeholders to much stronger, much more stringent requirements to actually balance stakeholder interest in corporate decision making. So it sounds like a technicality, but this could really, if it comes to pass, shift completely how companies position, take risks, how boards manage these issues. And it's currently a big debate, particularly around shifting from principles-based frameworks, particularly with a lot of comply or explain voluntary codes coupled with mandatory disclosure requirements, towards a much more regulated approach. And of course, there's pros and cons to all. So I would encourage you to watch this space to see how these things are evolving. So now on to the reality check. What does this mean in terms of implementation? And again, I always choose to focus not on governance for its own sake, but rather in terms of how it can help companies to improve their environmental and social performance, along with every other type of performance, including operational and financial. And in that regard, before having this talk with you today, I spoke with a series of practitioners in environmental impact assessment, in environmental permitting and auditing, mine closure, community and stakeholder engagement. And all of them, first of all, are inspirational in their vision for mining and minerals. So I want to thank them for their time. But also, they raised some really consistent themes for action within mining. And we drew some pretty simple recommendations as to how governance practices can best support progress on those themes and map those back fairly directly to governance principles of accountability and empowerment and transparency and fairness. So the first theme that comes up all the time when I discuss with my colleagues about how governance can support their work is commitments and obligations. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before because it's very much part of my experience as well. But I mean, let's consider that for an industry that's entirely dependent on access, operating, and commercialization rights, we seem to have enduring gaps in our management of the relating obligations and commitments. And if we bring all of that under a wide view of permitting, I think part of the issue is that it crosses the boundaries between regulatory, government relations, community engagement, operational risk. And of course, we think first and foremost of mineral title. But the fact is, permitting now encompasses hundreds, if not thousands, of approvals and commitments across a variety of instruments, and which touch on environmental constraints, social requirements, business operations. And these not only are binding on operators, but they also come full circle when non-compliance can affect mineral title through cross-default provisions. And that's before we even go into the dramatic situations where social license to operate weaknesses pretty much nullify mineral title because you can't actually do what your license allows you to do. So considering how essential this is to our business, what do we see in practice? We see not always a great track record, to be honest. We see binding plans and policies that are often prepared by great consultants and then instantly shelved. Sometimes they're misunderstood, sometimes they're completely ignored by operating teams who are not trained to leverage their local knowledge by mapping it back to these strategic tools. We also see very frequently incomplete, poorly monitored compliance and permitting registers, which, if they exist, are sometimes disseminated among various functions at site level. This, of course, in turn affects the quality and efficiency of management systems, which are mandated for environmental and social performance. And you realize that very often there's someone who knew but couldn't action that knowledge or get it to the right level of people, which indicates that decision-making is either ill-informed or inconsistent with corporate values and principles. And all of that really is allowed to pass because of a lack of oversight, both internal and external, in that regulatory authorities in many markets, particularly emerging markets, are sometimes not correctly equipped to actually challenge operators on these issues, which together combine to allow commitments to be ignored or unduly delayed. So there's a million examples, particularly in the community relations sphere. And quite frankly, it seems that the timing of most risk of non-compliance seems to be around the construction phase. For some reason, we get so hung up on delivering that a lot of ancillary issues suddenly become very, very secondary until, of course, they come right back to front and center. So I would say that the first collective recommendations that we formulated with my colleagues, and coming back to the governance angle, was really for the management of exploration and management and mining companies to define effective monitoring, coordination, and responsibilities for reporting, which go right to the top of the company without necessarily filtering environmental or social concerns through operational management. The second, more practical recommendation is to invest heavily in the environmental and social management system, and to use that system to ensure, first of all, that high quality data is provided to the board in particular, but also that this information turns into action and that this action is monitored. So these systems are really geared to create a circular flow of information and they should be a key part of achieving environmental and social performance. And frankly, they are typically governance tools. And the last recommendation is to work to bring top-level commitment, which is often expressed in policies and corporate statements, to middle and functional management levels, whether that's through stronger personal buy-in, incentivization, or redefinition of responsibilities. There's a second theme, which kind of relates to the first and which Susan already alluded to earlier, and that is the issue of silos and isolation. And of course, it's not a new issue, but it's particularly pressing in a context of integration, which by definition requires that sustainability and stakeholder concerns be pulled out of a neat little box and permeate all levels of decision-making so that they can become visible both in actions and outcomes by companies. So I see the silo issue actually play out in three different ways. The first and obvious one is the nearsighted view that, you know, E&S are allocated to a specific function or department or team, and that everybody else in the business can just carry on without worrying about it. The second aspect of the silo issue is quite interesting because I hadn't realized it was such an issue before speaking about it to my colleagues in environmental and social, which is the fact that you've got an increasing level of governance parameters integrated into environmental and social standards. So actually technicians in environmental and social performance are sometimes taken aback by this new aspect of their, you know, their own expertise. So we need to overcome that as well. And finally, the third sort of, you know, materialization of the silo issue, and perhaps the most pernicious, is the ongoing gap between corporate HQ and site or country offices. And it really disproportionately affects management of environmental, social, and governance matters. So I realize what I'm talking about here is a big culture change. In order to get there, I think there's a few, again, practical recommendations we can consider. The first one sounds fluffy, but is actually real in terms of its implementation, which is for management to embrace the notion that all management is change management in mining these days. So very often we see executives across all functions, not just environmental and social, who want to change habits, who want to allow more interdisciplinary decision-making, and they're not allowed to, or they're not incentivized to. So we need to make that shift to allow these outcomes to happen. The second practical recommendation is to lead by example. Senior executives need to be actively present in community engagement, in government relations, in public initiatives in country. And when I say actively, that means actually take action on the findings and outcomes of those initiatives. And a third recommendation is training. And in that regard, I just want to stress, businesses have a tendency to encourage and reward training that's primarily matching an employee's function or profession. What we're seeing here is a need for cross-functional training. So, you know, governance training for a team of geologists is actually a great step forward. Community engagement training for technical professionals, particularly across cultural and language barriers. Environmental and social impact training for governance consultants. All of these are ways for us to break out of our silos and understand each other's constraints better. And the last recommendation I will mention is really to try to turn one-way relationships into multilateral communication channels. And in this regard, I was really struck by the conclusion of one of my discussions about grievances. So we basically usually view the grievance mechanism as a huge headache and a risk, as in a threat. Whereas actually, if you open it up to become a healthy flow of information, not only can it be an early warning system, but it actually serves to continually create an exchange forum with a lot of affected stakeholders. So all of these are practical tools which I've experienced or implemented with my colleagues in environmental and social. There's also, as I said, a lot of debate about this. If you're interested, I recommend you look at the International Corporate Governance Network Governance of Sustainability Dialogue, which is happening in June. And do you have any questions? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ludivine. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together from the other side of your muted mics for the lovely, lovely Ludivine. Ludivine, I'm sure that we can post a link to that event that you just cited there and gave a shout out to, because I'm sure that lots of people will be interested in that. Time for just a couple of very quick questions. So one of which is, we see sometimes in perhaps national governance or regulation, people saying, okay, we understand the environment, we understand the social bits, but actually we really struggle to get governance into those sort of regulatory requirements. Do you have any insight as to that, or any solutions for us?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty much talking myself out of a job here, but I'd say the first step is to demystify. Governance is not a mysterious world of complicated words by lawyers and compliance officers. Governance is about effectively managing accountability and empowering people to be able to do their jobs in the best way possible to achieve the best outcomes possible. So when I hear about, groups struggling to integrate the governance angle into a thought process about ESG, frankly, my first recommendation is, well, start by not thinking about it. Map out what it is you're looking to achieve, because trust me, once you've mapped out those routes, you'll realize that half of that is governance, because governance is about having sound policies and processes, but also making sure that there's a culture to back those up, where they remain more than, quite frankly, paper stuck in corporate HQs.
So is that something there where actually with governance, exactly as you said, that's where the accountability, but also the culture really comes from, through which you take environment and social seriously? Is that correct?
I think it's entirely correct, but I think it's also where debates are starting to happen as to how that happens. So to date, you have, as I said, a lot of corporate governance frameworks which focus on ultimately all the way up to the board, but they create a general obligation for a company and its board to consider stakeholders, to look at long-term implications. There's now a lot of discussion about, should we regulate that? Should we make this a more mandatory system? Should we say, well, you can't decide in favor of the company, you need to always balance different stakeholder interests? So there's a lot of talk about the mechanics of implementing accountability. But before you get to all that, I mean, we all know how to say, okay, well, I committed to this, I'm going to do it this way, and I want positive outcomes to be that. So I think once we step back to the reality of what we're doing on the ground, a lot of the complexity falls into place. Not that I have a problem with complexity, but a lot of governance comes down to just doing our jobs well and considering others, in my view.
Perfect. That's absolutely fantastic, Ludivine. Thank you so much.